Baruch Spinoza died excommunicated, alone, and unknown to most of the world. 30 years later, his books were banned across Europe, condemned by Catholics, Protestants, and Jews alike. 2 centuries after that, philosophers called him the purest thinker who ever lived. What happened in between those 2 facts explains why his ideas still threaten comfortable assumptions today. Amsterdam, 1632. A baby boy was born into the Portuguese Jewish community, refugees who'd fled the Inquisition. They named him Baruch, which means blessed. His family ran a successful import business. His future seemed secure, predictable, ordinary. Nothing suggested this child would become the most dangerous philosopher in Europe. The Amsterdam where Spinoza grew up was unlike anywhere else on earth. The Dutch Republic had just won its independence from Spain, and Amsterdam was exploding into a global trading empire. Ships arrived daily from the East Indies, from Brazil, from Africa. Money poured in. Ideas followed. While most of Europe burned heretics and enforced religious conformity, Amsterdam offered something radical: tolerance. Not perfect tolerance, not tolerance as we'd recognize it today, but enough space for unusual thoughts to survive. The Portuguese Jewish community lived in this environment carefully. They'd escaped persecution in Spain and Portugal, where the Inquisition had forced Jews to convert to Christianity or die. Many had lived as crypto-Jews for generations, practicing their faith in secret while outwardly conforming to Catholicism. In Amsterdam, they could finally be openly Jewish again. But that freedom came with anxiety. They knew how fragile tolerance could be. Step too far out of line, attract too much negative attention from the Christian authorities, and everything could collapse. Young Baruch attended the community school, the Talmud Torah. He learned Hebrew, studied scripture, absorbed the commentaries of medieval rabbis. He was brilliant. Everyone could see it. The community leaders had plans for him. He might become a rabbi himself, a scholar who would bring honor to their community. His father Michael was a respected merchant, serving multiple times on the synagogue's governing board. The Spinoza family belonged. Then Michael died in 1654. Baruch was 22. He inherited the family business along with his brother Gabriel. For a brief moment, he tried to be a merchant. The records show him trading goods, managing accounts, appearing in commercial court over a debt. He was competent enough, but something else was pulling at him. He'd been asking questions that made his teachers uncomfortable. Not hostile questions, not yet. Just persistent inquiries about things everyone else took for granted. Why must we interpret scripture literally? What if the ancient texts were written by human beings with human limitations? How do we know which religious traditions are true and which are merely customs? These weren't abstract philosophical games for Spinoza. He genuinely wanted to know. The rabbis grew concerned. This young man was too smart, too questioning, too unwilling to accept authority. They'd seen this pattern before. Bright students who started doubting one thing rarely stopped there. And doubt was dangerous. The community's position in Amsterdam depended on appearing respectable, on not causing trouble. A heretic in their midst could threaten everything. We don't know exactly when Spinoza crossed the line from questioner to heretic. The process was gradual. He began spending time with freethinkers outside the Jewish community. He studied Latin, which opened access to the latest European philosophy. He read Descartes, the French philosopher who tried to rebuild all knowledge from scratch using pure reason. He encountered ideas about God, nature, and human beings that contradicted everything he'd been taught. Here's what we know for certain. By his early 20s, Spinoza had stopped believing in the personal God of Judaism. He no longer thought Moses wrote the Torah. He rejected the idea of an immortal soul separate from the body. He doubted that the Jews were God's chosen people in any unique sense. These weren't carefully hidden private doubts. He discussed them openly with anyone who asked. The community tried to save him. They offered him money, 1,000 florins a year, if he'd just keep quiet, if he'd continue attending synagogue and stop spreading his dangerous ideas. Spinoza refused. He wouldn't pretend. He couldn't lie about what he'd come to believe was true. On July 27, 1656, the governing board of the Portuguese Jewish community gathered in the synagogue. They were about to do something they'd done to only a handful of people before, something so severe it was reserved for the worst offenders. They were going to pronounce a cherem, a ban of excommunication, on Baruch Spinoza. The text of the cherem still exists. It's one of the harshest excommunication decrees ever recorded. Listen to the language. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. The Lord will not spare him. No one should communicate with him, neither in writing nor accord him any favour, nor stay with him under the same roof. It goes on, and on. The anger is palpable. Spinoza was 23 years old. Everything he'd known was gone. His community, his family connections, his business partnerships, his future as a respectable merchant. The Portuguese Jews weren't just his religious community, they were his entire social world. And they'd just expelled him permanently. Most people in his position would have panicked, converted to Christianity perhaps, or at least moderated their views, found some compromise. Spinoza did neither. He left Amsterdam, moved to the outskirts, and began supporting himself by grinding lenses for telescopes and microscopes. It was skilled work, decently paid, and crucially, it left his mind free. While his hands shaped glass, his thoughts ranged across the biggest questions human beings can ask. The lens grinding became part of his identity. He was a craftsman philosopher, working with his hands while thinking thoughts that would shake European intellectual life. The image is almost perfect. A man grinding and polishing glass until it became clear enough to see distant stars or tiny organisms, while simultaneously grinding and polishing ideas until they became clear enough to see reality itself. But we're getting ahead. Spinoza, in his mid-20s, wasn't yet the philosopher who'd terrify Europe. He was an excommunicated Jew living in a rented room, supporting himself through manual labour, reading philosophy in his spare time. His great works hadn't been written. His revolutionary system hadn't been developed. That transformation was still coming. What drove him? Why didn't he just accept the money, keep his mouth shut, and live a comfortable life? This question matters because it reveals something about the man. Spinoza had an absolute commitment to truth as he understood it. Not truth as comfortable belief or convenient fiction. Truth as reality, as what actually is, regardless of whether it fit his preferences or served his interests. He'd looked at the universe and concluded something that horrified his contemporaries. There is no supernatural realm, no God sitting in heaven dispensing rewards and punishments, no immortal soul that survives death, no free will in the sense most people understood it, no ultimate purpose or meaning written into the cosmos, just nature, operating according to necessary laws, playing itself out in infinite variations. This sounds bleak. It sounded bleak to most people in the 17th century too. If there's no divine justice, no afterlife, no cosmic meaning, then why be good? Why not just pursue pleasure and power while you can? This was the fear that made Spinoza dangerous. Not that his ideas were difficult or abstract, but that they seemed to destroy the foundations of morality and social order. Spinoza had an answer. We'll get to it, but first understand that he'd arrived at these conclusions not through bitterness or rebellion. He'd reasoned his way there through arguments he found logically compelling, and once convinced, he couldn't pretend otherwise. His integrity wouldn't allow it. The years after his excommunication were years of development. He moved from town to town, always staying near enough to Amsterdam to remain connected to intellectual networks, but far enough to avoid constant harassment. He lived simply, almost ascetically. He never married. He owned few possessions. He declined a professorship at the University of Heidelberg because it might restrict his freedom to think and write whatever conclusions he reached. His friends were mostly collegians and Mennonites, Christian groups that emphasized reason and tolerance over dogma. They created spaces where unconventional thinkers could meet and discuss forbidden topics. In these circles, Spinoza wasn't a heretic. He was a brilliant mind working on the most important questions facing humanity. He began writing, first, a treatise on God, man, and human well-being that he never finished. Then a geometric proof of Descartes' philosophy, demonstrating that he understood the dominant philosophical system of his age well enough to reproduce it in rigorous logical form. These early works were practice. He was developing his method, his style, his voice. The method mattered. Spinoza wanted certainty, not opinion. He wanted to build a philosophical system that had the same logical necessity as geometry. In geometry, you start with definitions and axioms, self-evident truths, and then derive theorems that must be true if your starting points are true. Spinoza believed the same approach could work for metaphysics, for ethics, for understanding reality itself. This wasn't mere intellectual ambition. He'd seen what happens when people base their beliefs on tradition, authority, or emotion. They fight wars, they burn heretics, they excommunicate questioners, they create misery in the name of God. If philosophy could be made rigorous, if truth could be demonstrated rather than merely asserted, maybe humanity could move beyond these endless conflicts. By his early 30s, Spinoza had begun his masterwork, the book that would contain his entire system, the book that would get him labelled an atheist, a blasphemer, the most dangerous man in Europe. He called it Ethics, not because it was only about morality, but because understanding ethics required understanding everything. God, nature, the human mind, emotions, freedom, happiness, everything connected to everything else in Spinoza's system. You couldn't grasp one piece without grasping the whole. The writing proceeded slowly. He worked through each proposition carefully, making sure every step followed necessarily from what came before. While he wrote, he also engaged in correspondence with intellectuals across Europe. Letters arrived asking about his views on specific questions. He responded thoughtfully, sometimes agreeing to let his correspondent share the letter with others, sometimes insisting on confidentiality. His ideas were spreading even before his books were published. But there was tension in his life during these years. The more his ideas circulated, the more dangerous they seemed to authorities. In 1670, he published his first major work under his own name, though even then he was cautious. The Theological Political Treatise appeared without the publisher's name on the title page. It was immediately controversial. Spinoza argued that the Bible was a historical document written by human beings, that miracles were impossible, that religious authorities had no legitimate power over philosophy or science, and that the state should guarantee freedom of thought and speech. Every claim was explosive. Every argument threatened someone's power. Religious leaders denounced the book. Political authorities banned it. Spinoza became famous, but not in a comfortable way. He was the man whose name you whispered, whose books you read secretly, whose ideas you debated behind closed doors. And this was just the beginning. The Theological Political Treatise was Spinoza's warm-up. His real system, the full statement of his philosophy, was still being written. Ethics was growing longer, more complex, more radical. When it was finally finished and published posthumously after his death, it would make the earlier book look tame by comparison. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand why ethics was so dangerous, we need to understand what Spinoza actually said. And that requires going back to the beginning, not the beginning of his life, but the beginning of his system. The first page of Ethics, Definition 1. Most philosophy books ease you in gradually. They build up to their radical claims slowly, giving you time to adjust. Spinoza does the opposite. He puts his most shocking idea right at the start, disguised as a simple definition. By substance, he writes, I understand what is in itself and is conceived through itself. Seems innocent enough. But watch what happens when he follows the logic. If something is truly a substance, truly independent, then nothing outside it can explain it or cause it. It must be self-caused, self-explanatory, and here's the kicker, there can only be one such thing. Because if there were two substances, each independent and self-explanatory, they'd have to differ in some way. But any difference would make one depend on something the other has, or lacks. They wouldn't really be independent after all. So there's only one substance, one reality that's truly fundamental. Everything else must be part of it, modifications of it, expressions of it. Spinoza calls this substance God. But don't let the word fool you. This is not the God of Judaism or Christianity or Islam. This is not a being who created the world and watches over it from outside. This God doesn't think or plan or judge. This God can't perform miracles or answer prayers because this God simply is the natural order itself. God and nature are the same thing. Deus sive natura, God or nature. Spinoza uses the phrases interchangeably, deliberately, showing they're two names for one reality. When you study physics, you're studying God. When you understand a mathematical truth, you're understanding something about God's nature. When you look at a tree or a stone or another person, you're looking at God's self-expression. The implications cascade. If God and nature are identical, then everything that happens necessarily. God can't choose to make things different because God doesn't choose anything. God isn't a person with desires and intentions. God is the logical structure of reality itself, unfolding according to eternal laws. The universe couldn't be any other way than it is. This means there's no creation story. The world wasn't made at some point in time. It has always existed because God has always existed, and God and the world are the same thing. There's no divine plan because there's no planner standing outside making decisions. There's only the infinite expression of one infinite substance through infinite modes. Spinoza proves all this geometrically. Definition, axiom, proposition, proof. Each step follows from the previous ones with logical necessity. By the end of part 1 of Ethics, he's demolished the traditional conception of God without ever raising his voice, without any polemic, simply by following the argument wherever it leads. Part 2 gets worse. From the perspective of religious authorities, here Spinoza tackles the human mind. What is thought? What is consciousness? How do minds relate to bodies? His answer is elegant and disturbing. Mind and body aren't two different things that somehow interact. They're two ways of understanding the same thing. Every physical event has a mental correlate. Every thought has a physical correlate. Not because one causes the other, but because they're the same event viewed under different attributes. Think of it like this. A circle drawn on paper can be described geometrically, in terms of equations and angles. It can also be described physically, in terms of ink molecules and their arrangement. These are two descriptions of one thing, not two things mysteriously connected. Similarly, a human being is one mode of the one substance, expressible either as body or as mind depending on how you're looking at it. This dissolves the mind-body problem that had plagued philosophy for centuries. Descartes had struggled to explain how an immaterial mind could move a material body. Spinoza's answer: wrong question. There's no interaction because there's no separation. The mental and the physical are parallel aspects of the same underlying reality. But this creates its own problems. If every physical event has a mental correlate, and if physical events follow deterministic laws, then mental events must also follow deterministic laws. Your thoughts aren't free choices bubbling up from an autonomous soul. They're necessary consequences of prior causes stretching back infinitely through the chain of nature. Free will, in the traditional sense, doesn't exist. You think you're choosing, but you're not. Your decisions are as determined as the orbit of planets or the growth of trees. The feeling of freedom is an illusion created by ignorance. You don't know all the causes that led to your decision, so it feels spontaneous. But if you could see the full causal chain, you'd recognize the necessity. Spinoza admits this is a hard pill to swallow. Most people desperately want to believe in free will. They need to feel that their choices matter, that they could have done otherwise, that they're not just puppets dancing to the strings of fate. He sympathizes, but he won't compromise the logic for comfort. Yet here's the strange twist. Accepting determinism doesn't lead to despair. It leads to freedom. Not the freedom of libertarian choice, but something deeper. The freedom that comes from understanding necessity. When you understand why things must be as they are, when you grasp the causal chains that produced this moment, you stop fighting against reality. You stop wishing things were different. You stop feeling angry at outcomes you couldn't prevent. This acceptance isn't resignation. It's a profound peace that comes from seeing how everything fits together. This is where Ethics Part 3 and 4 come in. Spinoza analyzes human emotions with the same geometric precision he applied to metaphysics. Each emotion is defined, its causes are traced, its effects are predicted. Anger, fear, love, jealousy, hope, despair. All of them are modes of the fundamental drive that characterizes every existing thing. The drive to persist in being. Everything that exists tries to continue existing. A stone resists being crushed. A plant grows toward the light. An animal hunts for food. A human pursues goals and forms relationships. This isn't a conscious choice. It's the basic fact of existence. To exist is to strive to keep existing. Emotions are variations of this striving. Joy is what we feel when our power of action increases. Sadness is what we feel when it decreases. Love is joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Hate is sadness accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Every emotion can be mapped, understood, explained through this framework. And here's what matters. Understanding your emotions changes them. When you recognize that your anger at someone stems from a misunderstanding of causes, the anger weakens. When you see that your anxiety about the future comes from imagining possibilities that may never occur, the anxiety lessens. Knowledge itself is therapeutic. This leads to Spinoza's ethics proper. Most ethical systems tell you what to do. Follow these commandments, pursue this virtue, maximize this outcome. Spinoza's ethics tells you how to be, specifically, how to be free within a deterministic universe. The key is developing what he calls adequate ideas. Most of your thoughts are inadequate. They're fragments, partial truths, confused perceptions. You see an effect but don't understand its causes. You feel an emotion but don't know why. You believe something because someone told you, not because you've grasped the reasons. Adequate ideas are different. They're complete, clear, connected to their causes. They're thoughts you've arrived at through reason, not accepted on authority. They're understanding that goes all the way down. The more adequate ideas you have, the more you understand the causal order of nature. And the more you understand that order, the more you align your own striving with it. You stop being buffeted by external forces. You stop reacting emotionally to every stimulus. You become, in a sense, more like God, self-determined, acting from your own nature rather than being pushed around by external causes. This is what Spinoza means by freedom. Not the freedom to have chosen otherwise, which is impossible and incoherent, but the freedom to act from understanding rather than confusion, from reason rather than passion, from your essential nature rather than external compulsion. And the highest form of this freedom is what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God. This isn't worship in any traditional sense. It's the joy that comes from understanding the infinite necessity of existence. It's loving reality for what it is, not what you wish it were. It's recognizing yourself as part of the eternal order, a temporary expression of the infinite substance. Those who achieve this understanding, Spinoza says, are eternal in a specific sense. Not that their individual personalities survive death, that's impossible, but the adequate ideas they've grasped are eternal truths. They participated in something timeless. The part of them that truly understood doesn't die, because it was never really temporal to begin with. This is the vision of ethics, a deterministic universe that's also divine, a denial of free will that leads to genuine freedom, an explanation of God that eliminates everything supernatural, a path to happiness that requires accepting necessity. You can see why it was dangerous. Every church taught that humans have free will and will be judged for their choices. Spinoza says choice is an illusion. Every religion promised immortality for the faithful. Spinoza says only your understanding survives, and even that not as an individual personality. Every authority claimed special access to divine truth. Spinoza says truth comes through reason alone, available to anyone willing to think clearly. The manuscript circulated among friends, while Spinoza was alive. They begged him not to publish it. The backlash from the theological political treatise had been severe enough. This would be worse, much worse. He'd be arrested, probably. His books would be burned. His friends might be implicated. Was it worth the risk? Spinoza agreed to wait. Ethics would be published after his death, when he couldn't be harmed by the consequences. But he kept working on it, refining arguments, adding propositions, making sure every logical connection was airtight. If this was going to be his legacy, it would be perfect. While he waited, he continued his other work. The lens grinding supported him financially. The correspondence continued. Visitors came to the house in The Hague, seeking conversation with the notorious philosopher. Some came to learn, some to debate, some simply to see if the rumours about him were true. He lived simply. One biographer describes his possessions after death: a bed, some furniture, books, lens-grinding equipment, a few clothes. No luxury items, no accumulated wealth. He'd refused a pension offered by the French king, not wanting his independence compromised. He'd refused a university position, not wanting to teach anything but what he believed to be true. The simplicity was deliberate. Spinoza's philosophy taught that external goods, wealth, fame, pleasure, were unreliable sources of happiness. They came and went with fortune. True satisfaction came from understanding. So he lived accordingly. Enough to survive, nothing excess, time devoted to thought. In early 1677, his health began failing. He'd always had weak lungs, probably from years of breathing in glass dust while grinding lenses. Now the symptoms worsened. Breathing became difficult. He continued working when he could, but the periods of productivity grew shorter. On February 21st, 1677, Baruch Spinoza died in his rented room in The Hague. He was 44 years old. The landlord and a local physician were present. His friends weren't notified in time to reach him. He died as he'd lived, quietly, without drama, accepting what couldn't be changed. The manuscript of Ethics was in his desk. His friends retrieved it along with his other unpublished works. Later that year, they published everything together in a volume titled Opera Posthuma, Posthumous Works. No publisher's name appeared on the title page. No author's name either, just the initials B.D.S. The reaction was immediate and fierce. The book was banned across Europe. Catholic and Protestant authorities agreed on little, but they agreed on this. Spinoza's philosophy was poison, atheism dressed up as logic, a denial of everything sacred, the most dangerous book of the age. And they were right, just not in the way they thought. The book that couldn't be published while its author lived would reshape philosophy for the next 3 centuries. But first it had to survive. Opera Posthuma appeared in late 1677. Within weeks, the Dutch authorities moved to suppress it. Too late. Copies had already spread across Europe through underground networks of scholars, freethinkers, and the simply curious. The cat was out of the bag. You could ban the book, but you couldn't unthink the ideas. What made ethics so dangerous wasn't just what it denied, it was what it offered instead. A complete system. An alternative worldview that didn't need God as traditionally conceived, didn't need priests or revelation, didn't need reward and punishment to make sense of existence. Everything derived from one central claim. There is only one substance, and that substance is nature, which is God. Start there and the rest follows with geometric necessity. If God is nature, then everything that happens is natural. Miracles become impossible. Not unlikely, impossible. A miracle would require God to violate his own nature, which is contradictory. Prayer becomes pointless. God can't change what's already necessarily determined. Sin becomes a misunderstanding. Nothing happens contrary to natural law, so nothing is truly evil in a cosmic sense. Just different expressions of the same underlying reality. The determinism was what people found hardest to swallow. Spinoza argued that human beings are part of nature, subject to the same causal laws as everything else. Your thoughts, your decisions, your actions, all of them flow necessarily from prior causes. You think you're choosing freely. Actually, you're just unaware of the causes determining your choice. Imagine a stone flying through the air. If the stone were conscious, it might believe it was choosing its trajectory. It would feel the movement from within and mistake that feeling for freedom. This is the human condition. We feel ourselves acting and assume we're free agents, but we're stones flying through the air, determined by forces we don't see. This sounds bleak. If everything is determined, why bother trying? Why make an effort to be good if you can't actually choose? Spinoza's answer was subtle. Understanding your determination is itself a kind of freedom. Not freedom to change what must happen, but freedom from false hopes and pointless regrets. You can't change the past, you can't alter the future, except by being what you are, but you can understand the causes acting on you. And understanding changes everything. Here's why. Most human suffering comes from inadequate ideas. We imagine we're separate from nature, above it, special. We form attachments to temporary things, wealth, status, pleasure, and suffer when they vanish. We hate people and circumstances that frustrate our desires. We live in constant anxiety about the future, constant disappointment about the present, all because we don't understand how things actually work. But suppose you grasp the necessity of everything. Suppose you see clearly that what happens must happen because of what came before. Suppose you understand yourself as a mode of the infinite substance, temporarily individuated but fundamentally part of the whole. Then your relationship to existence transforms. You stop raging against what you can't change. You stop fearing what hasn't happened. You stop wanting what would destroy you. This is what Spinoza called the intellectual love of God. Not emotion in the usual sense, not worship or devotion. A clear-eyed understanding of how things are, accompanied by acceptance, even joy. You see the necessity of existence and you love it. Not because it's pleasant, but because it's real. Because it couldn't be otherwise. Because you're part of it. The final propositions of ethics describe this state. The mind that understands nature, sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, achieves a kind of peace. Not the peace of ignorance or wishful thinking, the peace of comprehension. You see your life as one temporary expression of eternal substance. You see your death as natural transformation, not annihilation. You see other people as fellow modes, not competitors or threats. The whole picture snaps into focus. And in that focus, something survives. Spinoza is careful here. He's not promising personal immortality in any traditional sense. When you die, your body decomposes, returns to nature. Your individual personality, with all its memories and quirks, dissolves. But the understanding you achieved, the adequate ideas you formed, those remain. They're eternal truths, independent of the individual mind that grasped them. That part of you was never really individual anyway. It was the eternal mind knowing itself through you. This was cold comfort for most readers. They wanted heaven, personal continuation, reunion with loved ones. Spinoza offered participation in eternal truth. Take it or leave it. The book should have vanished, banned, condemned, suppressed by every authority that encountered it. Instead, it spread. Slowly at first, then faster. Copies were expensive, rare, dangerous to own. But people found ways. They read it in secret. They discussed it in private gatherings. They absorbed its arguments and started seeing the world differently. A generation passed, then another. The scandal faded slightly. You could reference Spinoza in academic contexts, though still with caution. Philosophers began engaging with his arguments seriously instead of just denouncing them. Some found flaws in the logic. Others found the logic sound but the conclusions unacceptable. Still others found themselves convinced despite their better judgment. By the mid-18th century, something strange was happening. Spinozism was seeping into European thought through 1,000 tiny cracks. People who'd never read ethics were absorbing ideas that originated there. The notion that nature operates by fixed laws, that everything has a cause, that the universe is a unified system. These became common assumptions among educated people. They didn't know they were thinking like Spinoza, but they were. The German Enlightenment took Spinoza seriously. Gotthold Lessing, the great playwright and philosopher, was rumoured to be a Spinozist. When his friend Friedrich Jacobi revealed this after Lessing's death, it caused a scandal. Lessing was respectable, celebrated, Christian. How could he have accepted Spinoza's atheism? The revelation triggered what historians call the pantheism controversy, a decade-long debate about whether Spinoza's ideas were compatible with religion, morality, civilization itself. The debate made Spinoza impossible to ignore. You might reject him, but you had to know what you were rejecting. Kant read him. Hegel read him. Every major German philosopher of the late 1700s and early 1800s wrestled with the system laid out in ethics. Some tried to refute it. Some tried to modify it. Some embraced it entirely. The Romantics loved Spinoza. Here was a philosophy that made nature divine, that saw the universe as organic whole, that offered mystical union through intellectual contemplation. The poet Novalis called him the God-intoxicated man. Goethe studied Spinoza throughout his life, finding in ethics a vision that matched his own sense of nature's creative power. The young Romantic movement claimed Spinoza as spiritual ancestor. Meanwhile, scientists were quietly vindicating his approach. Spinoza had insisted that nature operates by knowable laws without exception. The scientific method of the 18th and 19th centuries proved him right. Newton's physics, Lavoisier's chemistry, Darwin's biology, all of them assumed what Spinoza had argued. Natural causation, no miracles, law-governed processes extending across all phenomena, Darwin's Origin of Species. In 1859 was particularly striking. Here was a mechanism explaining human existence without reference to divine creation. Humans were natural beings, products of evolution, continuous with the rest of life. The special creation story collapsed. Spinoza had said humans were modes of nature, not separate souls temporarily housed in bodies. Darwin provided the details. The 19th century saw Spinoza fully rehabilitated. Academic philosophers studied him as a major figure, equal to Descartes or Leibniz. Biographies appeared. Scholarly editions of his works were published. What had been dangerous heterodoxy became respected philosophy. But the ideas remained challenging. Determinism still troubled people. If everything is caused, where does moral responsibility come from? If humans are just natural beings, what makes human life valuable? If there's no personal God-judging actions, why be good? These questions didn't go away just because Spinoza was respectable. The 20th century brought new angles. Einstein reportedly kept a copy of Ethics on his desk. When asked if he believed in God, he said he believed in Spinoza's God, the God revealed in the orderly harmony of what exists. Quantum mechanics raised questions about determinism, but the basic Spinozist vision of nature as unified causal system remained central to physics. Neuroscience started catching up to Spinoza. Brain imaging revealed that conscious decisions are preceded by unconscious neural activity. The experience of free will might be what Spinoza said it was, an illusion created by ignorance of the causes determining our choices. Studies of emotion confirmed his analysis. Feelings follow from bodily states, not vice versa. The mind-body problem looked less mysterious from a Spinozist perspective, one substance with different attributes. Contemporary philosophers still argue about ethics. Some defend updated versions of Spinoza's determinism. Others insist he was wrong about free will, that quantum indeterminacy or emergent complexity leaves room for genuine choice. The debates get technical, involving modal logic, philosophy of mind, metaphysics, but they're still responses to arguments made in the 1660s by a lens grinder in Voorburg. What's remarkable is how modern Spinoza feels. He wrote before the scientific revolution was complete, before Darwin, before neuroscience, before quantum mechanics, yet his core insights keep being rediscovered. The unity of nature, the identity of mind and body as different aspects of one thing, the role of understanding in achieving peace, the possibility of finding meaning without supernatural beliefs. There's something else too, Spinoza's method, the geometric proofs, the axioms and propositions that seems antiquated now. Nobody writes philosophy that way anymore, but the underlying commitment to clarity, to logical rigor, to saying exactly what you mean and defending it with argument, that's still the gold standard. When philosophers want to praise someone's work, they say it's rigorous, systematic, carefully argued. Those are Spinozist virtues. The personal influence runs deeper. Students encounter ethics in philosophy courses, and some of them have experiences like Spinoza's early readers. The system grips them. The logic feels airtight. The conclusions follow whether you like them or not. And suddenly the world looks different. Anger at circumstances diminishes. Why rage at what must be? Anxiety about the future lessens. It will unfold according to causes you can understand. Fear of death becomes manageable. You're part of something that doesn't end. Not everyone has this reaction. Some read ethics and bounce right off, but those who connect with it often find it transformative. Spinoza himself would have appreciated the irony. He lived in obscurity, died young, published almost nothing under his own name. The work he considered most important appeared only after his death, was immediately banned, brought no recognition in his lifetime. He had no students, founded no school, left no disciples to carry on his tradition. By conventional measures, he failed completely, and yet 3 centuries later, his ideas are everywhere. The scientific worldview he helped create is now the default educated position. The arguments he made about nature, causation, and determinism are standard topics in university courses. His vision of finding peace through understanding influences everything from Stoicism's modern revival to cognitive behavioral therapy. The lens grinder from Voorburg changed how humanity thinks. Not bad for someone who never travelled, never married, never held a university position, never sought fame, never compromised his principles for comfort or safety. Who just ground lenses, wrote philosophy, and died at 44. But Spinoza's story doesn't end with his death. Ideas have lives of their own. The book he left behind would find readers he never imagined, influence movements he couldn't have predicted, and help create a world that would have astonished him. The question that haunted him from the day of his excommunication, what does it mean to live well without traditional religion, was about to be answered in ways stranger than any philosophy. The 18th century brought something Spinoza never anticipated: celebrity. Not for him, he was safely dead. But his ideas began escaping the underground networks of manuscript copies and clandestine reading circles. They started appearing in respectable salons, in published books, in the conversations of people who would have recoiled from atheism, but found themselves agreeing with arguments that led exactly there. The mechanism was indirect. Few philosophers wanted to admit reading Spinoza, much less being influenced by him. The stigma remained toxic, but his ideas had a way of seeping into the groundwater of European thought, surfacing in unexpected places, unattributed but unmistakable. Pierre Bayle's Historical and Critical Dictionary, published starting in 1697, contained a long article on Spinoza that was ostensibly critical, but actually explained his system with such clarity that readers could judge for themselves. The article became one of the dictionary's most read entries. Thousands of educated Europeans encountered Spinoza's arguments through Bayle, often for the first time. Then came the German Enlightenment, and here things got interesting. Gotthold Ephraim Lessing was a playwright, critic, and theologian who became one of Germany's most influential thinkers in the 1770s. He was also, as it turned out, a closet Spinozist. He didn't advertise this. It would have destroyed his career. But in private conversations with trusted friends, he admitted that he found Spinoza's system compelling, perhaps even true. One of those friends was Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, who was horrified. After Lessing died in 1781, Jacobi published an account of their conversations, revealing Lessing's Spinozism to the shocked German public. The revelation triggered what became known as the pantheism controversy, a multi-year debate about Spinoza's ideas that consumed German intellectual life. Was Spinoza an atheist or a pantheist? Could his philosophy be reconciled with Christianity? Did his determinism destroy morality? The debates raged in books, pamphlets, and journals. Everyone had an opinion. And suddenly, Spinoza's name was everywhere. Moses Mendelssohn, the leading Jewish philosopher of the German Enlightenment and Lessing's close friend, entered the fray to defend both Lessing and a more moderate interpretation of Spinoza. Mendelssohn argued that Spinoza's system could be understood as a form of refined pantheism rather than atheism, that God and nature weren't separate but also weren't simply identical in the crude way critics claimed. The controversy made Spinoza's ideas public property. You couldn't be an educated German in the 1780s without having an opinion about Spinoza. The ban was effectively broken. Not officially, the books were still prohibited, but the prohibition had become unenforceable. This opened the floodgates. The generation of German thinkers who came of age in the 1790s, the generation that would create German idealism, grew up debating Spinoza. He became impossible to ignore. Johann Gottlieb Fichte read ethics and initially saw it as the only serious alternative to his own idealism. The system's rigour impressed him even as he rejected its conclusions. He spent years working through Spinoza's arguments, trying to show where they went wrong, and in the process developed his own philosophy partly in response. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling went further. In his early 20s, he published work that was essentially Spinozism updated with modern science. Nature as a dynamic, self-organizing system. Mind and matter as two aspects of one reality. The absolute as knowable through intellectual intuition. It was ethics with a romantic accent. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel absorbed Spinoza so thoroughly that traces appear throughout his work. The idea of substance becoming subject, the rational structure of reality, the method of immanent development. Hegel's notorious difficulty partly stems from his attempt to preserve Spinozist insights while transforming them into something dynamic and historical rather than static and eternal. Then there was Goethe. The greatest German writer of the age encountered Spinoza in his 20s, and it changed everything. He found in ethics a worldview that matched his own intuitions about nature, unity, and the divine. For the rest of his life, Goethe considered himself a Spinozist. Though he interpreted the system in his own way, emphasizing creativity and development over geometric necessity. The young Romantics seized on Spinoza as their philosopher. Friedrich Schlegel, Novalis, Friedrich Hölderlin. They all read ethics and saw in it a vision of unity that spoke to their deepest aspirations. The idea of the infinite expressing itself through finite things, of nature as alive and purposeful, of achieving peace through understanding, these became central Romantic themes. By 1800, Spinoza had gone from dangerous heretic to philosophical touchstone. Not universally accepted, he still had fierce critics, but impossible to dismiss. Any serious philosopher had to take a position on Spinoza's system. You could reject it, modify it, incorporate parts of it, but you couldn't ignore it. The 19th century brought an even stranger development. Spinoza became respectable. The Jewish community that had expelled him began, slowly, to reconsider. Not officially, there was no formal reversal of the Sherem, but individual Jewish thinkers started claiming him as one of their own, seeing in his philosophy a distinctly Jewish approach to ultimate questions. Heinrich Heine, the German Jewish poet, called Spinoza the greatest among modern philosophers, and saw his thought as emerging from the Jewish tradition even as it broke with it. Moses Hess, an early Zionist thinker, argued that Spinoza represented the highest development of Jewish rationalism. By the late 19th century, you could find Spinoza's portrait in Jewish homes, his name invoked with pride rather than shame. The man Amsterdam had expelled was becoming a symbol of Jewish intellectual achievement. The scientific community embraced him too, as physics, chemistry, and biology developed more rigorous, law-governed understandings of nature. Spinoza's vision of a universe operating by necessity started looking prescient rather than dangerous. Charles Darwin never mentions Spinoza in his published work, but the parallels are striking. Nature as a self-sufficient system. No need for external intervention. Everything explicable through natural causes. The origin of species could be read as working out in biological detail what Spinoza had claimed in metaphysical terms. Ernst Haeckel, the German biologist who popularized Darwin's ideas, was an explicit Spinozist. He saw evolution as confirming the unity of nature that Spinoza had articulated. His monism, the view that matter and spirit are two aspects of one substance, was essentially Spinozism in scientific dress. Albert Einstein, when asked if he believed in God, reportedly said he believed in Spinoza's God, the God revealed in the harmony of all being, not a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings. Whether Einstein actually said this or it's an elegant legend, it captured something real. The God of Spinoza, identical with the rational structure of nature itself, appealed to scientifically minded people who wanted some sense of the sacred without supernatural intervention. The 20th century brought yet another transformation. Spinoza became a resource for understanding modern problems. Psychologists found in his theory of the affects a sophisticated account of emotional dynamics that anticipated later discoveries. Political theorists rediscovered his arguments about democracy and free speech. Environmentalists saw his view of nature's unity as prescient ecological thinking. Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, wrote a book in the 1960s arguing that Spinoza offered an alternative to the entire Western tradition's way of thinking. Not substance as static being, but as productive power. Not morality as judgment, but as ethics of joy and capacity. Spinoza became, improbably, a hero of postmodern French philosophy. Antonio Negri, the Italian political theorist, found in Spinoza resources for thinking about democracy, collective power, and resistance to authority. The lens grinder's political writings, which had seemed tangential to his main work, suddenly looked like sophisticated analyses of how power operates and how freedom can be achieved. Neuroscientists started citing him. Antonio Damasio wrote an entire book, Looking for Spinoza, arguing that modern neuroscience was confirming what Spinoza had intuited about the connection between emotion, reason, and decision-making. The mind-body problem that Spinoza had tried to dissolve by making them two aspects of one thing looked less absurd once you understood the brain as both physical organ and seat of consciousness. Environmental ethics found inspiration in his view that humans aren't separate from nature, but part of it, subject to the same laws, pursuing the same fundamental drive to persist in being. Deep ecology, the movement arguing for nature's intrinsic value independent of human purposes, could claim Spinoza as an ancestor. Even cognitive science, the interdisciplinary study of mind and intelligence, found Spinoza relevant. His account of how ideas follow from other ideas according to necessary patterns, how understanding requires grasping causal connections, how error arises from partial knowledge, all of this maps surprisingly well onto modern theories of cognition. The influence is often indirect. Most scientists haven't read ethics, but the Spinozist vision of nature as unified, law-governed, and comprehensible through reason has become the background assumption of modern science. We're all Spinozists now, in that basic sense, whether we know it or not. Yet something paradoxical happened alongside this growing influence. Spinoza, the person, faded. Everyone knew his ideas or versions of them. Few knew his life, the dramatic story, the excommunication, the assassination attempt, the quiet years grinding lenses, the early death. All this became obscure historical detail. He became what he might have wanted to be, a pure intellect, a system of thought divorced from biography. The man disappeared into the philosophy. Until recently, the past few decades have seen renewed interest in Spinoza's life, precisely because the contrast with his philosophy is so striking. Here was someone who argued that emotions are modifications of desire, that understanding brings peace, that the free person fears nothing, not even death, and he lived it. The assassination attempt didn't make him flee. The poverty didn't make him compromise. The isolation didn't embitter him. The life and the philosophy aligned in a way that's rare among thinkers. Most philosophers don't live according to their own principles. Spinoza did. That's part of why he fascinates. There's also growing recognition that his Jewishness matters. For a long time, people treated Spinoza as having transcended his Jewish background, as if the Excommunication severed all connection. But recent scholarship shows how deeply Jewish his thinking remained. The interpretive methods, the emphasis on rational analysis of sacred texts, the concern with right living rather than correct belief, the idea of intellectual love as the highest human achievement, all of this comes from Jewish tradition, even as it breaks with orthodoxy. He was simultaneously the most Jewish and the most anti-Jewish thinker of his age. The tension is unresolvable, and that's part of what makes him compelling. Amsterdam has come around too. The city that expelled him now claims him proudly. There's a Spinoza house, a Spinoza monument, Spinoza walking tours. The excommunication hasn't been lifted. There's no mechanism for that in Jewish law. But the modern Jewish community in Amsterdam acknowledges him as one of their own, a complicated figure whose break with tradition was itself a kind of Jewish argument. In 2012, the chief rabbi of Amsterdam said that were Spinoza alive today, he might not be excommunicated, that the cherem reflected its time and circumstances rather than eternal judgment. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was recognition that history had vindicated the lens grinder. What would Spinoza make of all this? The fame, the influence, the rehabilitation? Probably nothing. He wrote in Ethics that the free person thinks of nothing less than of death, and his whole life is a meditation not on death but on life. He wasn't working for posterity. He was working out what he thought was true and trying to live accordingly. The irony is that this very indifference to legacy is part of why his legacy endures. He wasn't trying to found a school or build a following. He was trying to understand. And understanding, once achieved, doesn't depend on who achieved it or when or why. The ideas are what matter. And the ideas, it turns out, were explosives waiting to go off. Spinoza's ethics wasn't just philosophy. It was a blueprint for dismantling everything European society was built on. God, monarchy, revealed religion, human exceptionalism, free will, the entire metaphysical structure that justified who ruled and why. Once you accepted Spinoza's premises, the whole edifice collapsed, which is why for most of the 18th century, Spinozism was the ultimate intellectual danger. To call someone a Spinozist was to accuse them of atheism, immorality, and subversion all at once. The label was toxic, and it was everywhere. The strange thing is that most people using the term had never read Spinoza. They knew the reputation, the vague sense of danger, but not the actual arguments. Spinoza became a kind of philosophical boogeyman, invoked whenever someone wanted to discredit a radical idea. Your opponent questions divine providence. Spinozist doubts miracles. Spinozist suggests that morality might have a natural basis. Definitely a Spinozist. It became shorthand for everything the establishment feared. But beneath the official condemnations, something else was happening. People were reading him, secretly, carefully, with the kind of attention you give forbidden texts. The underground circulation of Spinoza's works created a shadow intellectual tradition, one that couldn't declare itself publicly, but shaped thinking nonetheless. This was especially true in France. The French Enlightenment, that explosion of rational inquiry that would eventually fuel revolution, was soaked in Spinoza. Not openly. You couldn't cite him in polite company, but the arguments, the methods, the fundamental assumptions about nature and reason, and the limits of authority, these were Spinozist through and through. Denis Diderot read him obsessively. Baron d'Holbach's salon, where the most radical thinkers in Paris gathered, was basically a Spinoza study group. The encyclopedia, that massive project to systematize human knowledge, operated on Spinozist principles, even when it didn't say so. Voltaire presents a fascinating case. He attacked Spinoza publicly, called his system absurd, made jokes at his expense, standard practice for someone who wanted to avoid censorship. But Voltaire's private letters tell a different story. He admitted that Spinoza was one of the most rigorous thinkers who ever lived, that his arguments were difficult to refute, that anyone who really engaged with the ethics had to take it seriously. The public dismissal was cover. The private respect was real. Jean-Jacques Rousseau went further. His idea that civilization corrupts natural goodness, that humans are born free but are everywhere in chains, that legitimate government requires consent rather than divine right. All of this builds on Spinozist foundations. Rousseau added emotion where Spinoza had cold analysis, but the underlying framework about nature, power, and human potential came from the lens grinder. Then there's the German response, which was different. Where the French absorbed Spinoza secretly and selectively, the Germans confronted him directly. They had to, because by the late 18th century, Spinoza had become unavoidable for anyone doing serious philosophy. Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, one of Germany's leading intellectuals, admitted near the end of his life that he was a Spinozist. The confession was private, shared with a friend who published it after Lessing's death. The revelation caused a scandal. How could a respected figure, someone who'd spent decades defending rational Christianity, turn out to be a follower of the atheist philosopher? But Lessing's point was precisely that Spinoza wasn't an atheist. God was everywhere in his system, just not the God of traditional religion. This triggered what scholars call the pantheism controversy, a years-long debate about whether Spinozism was compatible with religion, with morality, with German culture. The fight got nasty. Careers were damaged, friendships ended, and through it all, everyone kept reading Spinoza, trying to figure out what exactly he'd said and whether it was as dangerous as people claimed. Immanuel Kant watched this controversy from Königsberg and drew his own conclusions. He never became a Spinozist, actually spent considerable energy trying to refute Spinoza's determinism, but the effort shaped Kant's own system. His insistence that we can't know things in themselves, that our knowledge is limited to appearances, that morality requires freedom, all of this was developed partly in response to Spinoza's challenge. You can't understand Kant without understanding what he was arguing against. The same goes for Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who took Kant's framework and pushed it towards something that looked suspiciously Spinozist. Then Friedrich Schelling, who tried to reconcile Spinoza with German idealism. Then Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, whose absolute idealism was basically Spinozism translated into a different vocabulary. Hegel even said it explicitly: to be a philosopher, you must first be a Spinozist. The entire German philosophical tradition, from Kant through Hegel, was one long conversation with a dead lens grinder. The poets got involved too. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe discovered Spinoza in his 20s, and it changed everything. Before Spinoza, Goethe's work was all storm and stress, emotional turbulence, romantic excess. After reading the Ethics, something shifted. The mature Goethe, the one who wrote Faust and Wilhelm Meister, had Spinozist calm running underneath the drama. He called Spinoza the most Christian of philosophers, which was his way of saying that Spinoza embodied the ethics without the dogma. Novalis, the quintessential German romantic, wrote that Spinoza was a God-intoxicated man. The phrase stuck. It captured something essential about how Spinoza approached philosophy, not as dry technical work, but as a kind of spiritual practice, a path to something beyond ordinary understanding. The Romantics recognized a kindred spirit, even though Spinoza's rationalism seemed opposite to their emotional intensity. Samuel Taylor Coleridge brought Spinoza to England, or tried to. He studied the ethics obsessively, filled notebooks with commentary, insisted that English philosophy needed to engage with continental thought. But England was even more resistant than Germany. The empirical tradition was strong, the religious establishment powerful, and Spinoza's reputation as an atheist still toxic. Coleridge had to be careful. He influenced people, Wordsworth especially, but always indirectly. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening in Jewish circles. The very community that had expelled Spinoza was slowly, quietly, beginning to reconsider. Moses Mendelssohn, the leading Jewish philosopher of the late 18th century, refused to call himself a Spinozist, but his work showed clear influence. Mendelssohn's project, creating a Judaism compatible with Enlightenment rationalism, was inconceivable without Spinoza having gone first. Solomon Maimon, another Jewish philosopher, took things further. He argued that Spinoza had been right about substance monism, that the traditional Jewish conception of God as separate from creation was philosophically untenable. Maimon didn't reject Judaism, he reinterpreted it along Spinozist lines. This was heresy by orthodox standards, but it opened space for Jewish thinkers to claim Spinoza as part of their tradition, rather than a traitor to it. The 19th century accelerated everything. As Europe moved towards secularization, revolution, and scientific materialism, Spinoza stopped being dangerous and started being vindicated. His rejection of miracles, his naturalistic explanation of scripture, his insistence that political power requires consent, all of this moved from radical fringe to mainstream assumption. Not because people became Spinozists, but because the culture absorbed Spinozist ideas so thoroughly they became invisible. Charles Darwin never mentioned Spinoza, but Origin of Species operates on Spinozist principles. Nature as self-organizing, life as modification of substance, humans as part of rather than separate from the natural world. This is Spinoza's framework applied to biology. Darwin's revolution was possible because Spinoza had already prepared the ground. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were more explicit. They called Spinoza the founder of modern materialism, recognized his influence on their own work. Historical materialism, the idea that economic relations shape everything else, that consciousness arises from material conditions rather than vice versa. This owes clear debt to Spinoza's substance monism. They stripped away his language about God, kept the deterministic structure. Sigmund Freud was another secret Spinozist. He never said so directly, but the parallels are unmistakable. The idea that we're driven by forces we don't understand, that consciousness is a small part of mental life, that understanding our nature can free us from destructive patterns, all of this echoes Spinoza's theory of affects. Psychoanalysis is basically applied Spinozism, an attempt to achieve through therapeutic method what Spinoza thought philosophy could accomplish. Even physicists started paying attention. Albert Einstein famously said he believed in Spinoza's God, the one revealed in the harmony of what exists, not the one concerned with human actions. Einstein's deterministic universe, his insistence that God doesn't play dice, his conviction that the cosmos operates according to comprehensible laws, this was Spinozist to the core. When Einstein rejected quantum indeterminacy, he was defending the same deterministic vision Spinoza had articulated 3 centuries earlier. The 20th century brought full rehabilitation. Spinoza went from banned to celebrated, from heretic to hero. Universities taught his work openly. Scholars produced critical editions of his texts. Philosophers debated his arguments without fear of censorship. The journey from excommunication to academic respectability took nearly 300 years, but it happened. Yet something was lost in the translation. As Spinoza became acceptable, he also became safe. The revolutionary edge dulled. Students read the ethics like any other historical text, mining it for arguments, analysing its structure, comparing it to other systems. The visceral danger, the sense that these ideas could overturn your entire understanding of reality, mostly disappeared. Spinoza became another name in the canon, important but domesticated. Some thinkers resisted this sanitization. Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, wrote a book arguing that Spinoza was still radical, that his ethics remained a challenge to conventional morality and metaphysics. Deleuze emphasized Spinoza's philosophy of joy, his celebration of power and becoming, his rejection of transcendence. This was Spinoza for the counterculture. Spinoza as liberator rather than system builder. Antonio Negri took a different angle, reading Spinoza as a political philosopher of resistance. Negri saw in the theological political treatise a theory of democracy more radical than anything that came after, a vision of collective power that anticipated modern movements for liberation. Spinoza the revolutionary, not Spinoza the metaphysician. Feminist philosophers discovered Spinoza too. His monism eliminated the mind-body dualism that had justified so much patriarchal thinking. His ethics grounded in power and relation rather than hierarchy and submission offered resources for rethinking gender. The fact that Spinoza himself had conventional views about women became less important than the tools his philosophy provided for critique. Environmental thinkers found value in his rejection of anthropocentrism, his insistence that humans are modifications of nature rather than separate from or above it. Deep ecology, the movement arguing for intrinsic value in non-human nature, has Spinozist roots whether it acknowledges them or not. The idea that everything is interconnected, that harming nature harms ourselves, that we need to overcome the illusion of separation, this comes straight from ethics. Neuroscientists started citing him too, as brain research revealed the extent to which consciousness depends on physical processes, How much of our experience is determined by neural activity we don't control? Spinoza's determinism looked less like philosophical speculation and more like empirical description. Antonio Damasio wrote an entire book looking for Spinoza, arguing that modern neuroscience was catching up to what the lens grinder had intuited 3 centuries earlier. The Rehabilitation is nearly complete. Amsterdam celebrates him. Scholars study him. His ideas permeate contemporary thought. The man who died in obscurity, whose work was banned for generations, who was written out of Jewish history, has become one of the most influential philosophers who ever lived. The lens grinder from Orinesburg changed the world, just not in his lifetime. But does that mean Spinoza was right? That's the question we've been circling around. We've watched his ideas spread, seen his influence grow, traced his journey from heretic to hero. But influence isn't truth. Popularity isn't proof. The fact that neuroscientists cite him, that Einstein admired him, that philosophers still debate him, none of that tells us whether his system actually captures reality. Start with determinism. Spinoza claimed everything that happens must happen exactly as it does. No alternatives, no possibilities, just necessity unfolding. Is that true? Physics suggests maybe. The laws governing particles don't leave room for spontaneity. If you know the position and momentum of every particle in the universe, classical physics says you could calculate the entire future. Spinoza's vision seems validated, except quantum mechanics complicates everything. At the subatomic level, events appear genuinely random. Particles don't have definite positions until measured. Outcomes are probabilistic, not determined. Einstein hated this, called it incomplete, insisted God doesn't play dice, but the experiments keep confirming it. Quantum indeterminacy seems real. Does that refute Spinoza? Not necessarily. Maybe randomness at the quantum level still produces determinism at higher levels. Maybe what looks like chance is just complexity we can't track. Or maybe Spinoza was wrong about this part. The universe might contain genuine openness, real contingency, possibilities that don't actualize. What about the mind-body problem? Spinoza said mind and body aren't separate substances but different attributes of the same thing. Modern neuroscience seems to support this. Brain states correlate perfectly with mental states. Damage the brain, you damage the mind. No evidence for souls floating free of matter. But correlation isn't explanation. We still don't understand how physical processes produce consciousness. Why does neural activity feel like something? Why is there subjective experience at all? This is the hard problem of consciousness, and Spinoza didn't solve it. He just declared mind and body identical without explaining how that works. His solution was elegant but might be too elegant. It makes the problem disappear by definition rather than solving it. That's philosophically suspicious. When a theory makes a hard problem vanish through redefinition, check whether it's actually answering the question or just changing the subject. Then there's God. Spinoza's God is nature, impersonal, following necessary laws, containing everything. This isn't the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's barely God at all in any traditional sense. It's just reality, dressed up with theological language. Some people find this profound. The sacred isn't elsewhere, it's here. Divinity isn't transcendent, it's immanent. God isn't a person judging us, but the totality of existence itself. This speaks to people who want spirituality without supernaturalism, who crave meaning without mythology. Others find it empty. If God just means nature, why use the word God? If everything is divine, nothing is. The term loses meaning through overextension. Spinoza's God doesn't answer prayers, doesn't care about humans, doesn't even know we exist. That's not religion, it's rebranded atheism. Both reactions are valid. Spinoza's God works for some people, fails for others. Whether it's true depends partly on what you need God to do. If you want a being who intervenes, who listens, who loves, Spinoza offers nothing. If you want a framework for understanding existence as unified and intelligible, he provides that. His ethics faces similar questions. The claim that virtue is its own reward, that acting from reason produces joy, that freedom comes from understanding necessity, all of this sounds good. But does it work? Try it. Next time you're angry, try understanding your anger as determined by causes. Does that make you less angry? Next time you want something destructive, try reasoning your way to better desires. Does that work? For some people, yes. Spinoza's approach to emotions through understanding genuinely helps. For others, reason alone isn't enough. We need practices, communities, structures that support different ways of being. His political philosophy aged better than his psychology. The argument for free speech, for separating church and state, for democracy as the most natural form of government, history vindicated these claims. Societies that followed Spinoza's principles generally did better than those that didn't. Theocracies failed. Democracies succeeded. Free inquiry produced progress. But even here, complications arise. Spinoza assumed rational people would converge on truth if allowed to think freely. 3 centuries of free inquiry later, we have more disagreement than ever. Information didn't end conflict, it amplified it. Maybe humans aren't as rational as Spinoza hoped. Maybe reason alone can't resolve our deepest disputes. The lens grinder's system was admirably consistent. Every piece fit with every other piece. If you accept the starting axioms, the conclusions follow necessarily. That's philosophically impressive. But consistency isn't the same as correctness. You can build a perfectly coherent system on false foundations. Modern physics is inconsistent. General relativity contradicts quantum mechanics. Both theories work in their domains, but they can't both be fully true. Reality itself might be messier than any single consistent system can capture. Spinoza's beautiful edifice might be too neat for a messy universe. Yet something persists, not the specific claims about substance or attributes, not the geometric method or the technical terminology, something deeper, an attitude, a way of approaching existence. Spinoza taught people to look at the world without flinching. No comforting illusions, no supernatural escape hatches, no pretending humans are special. Just reality, as it is, studied carefully, understood as deeply as possible. That intellectual courage still matters. He showed that you could build an ethical life without divine commands. Morality doesn't require gods or afterlives. It can emerge from understanding what we are and what promotes human flourishing. That project continues in secular ethics today. He demonstrated that rejecting traditional religion doesn't mean rejecting meaning. You can find wonder in nature, purpose in understanding, joy in existence itself. The universe doesn't need a transcendent designer to be worthy of awe. That sensibility runs through much modern thought. And he proved that marginalized thinkers can change the world. A Jewish lens grinder, excommunicated by his community, ignored by his contemporaries, banned by governments, still managed to plant ideas that reshaped Western civilization. You don't need institutional power to have intellectual influence. You need clarity, courage, and patience. So was Spinoza right? About some things, probably. About others, probably not. About everything? Definitely not. Decisive. No philosopher gets everything right. Philosophy isn't about finding the one true system. It's about asking the right questions and developing tools for thinking clearly about them. Spinoza gave us tools. His analysis of freedom and determinism, his naturalistic approach to ethics, his political arguments for tolerance, his insistence on intellectual rigor. These remain valuable even if his specific metaphysics fails. You can reject his conclusions while learning from his method. The ethics isn't scripture. It's not a revealed truth that must be accepted whole or rejected whole. It's a sustained argument, that you can engage with, push back against, learn from even in disagreement. That's what living philosophy means. Not worshipping dead thinkers, but thinking alongside them. Contemporary philosophers still write about Spinoza because his questions remain live. How do mind and body relate? Can determinism coexist with moral responsibility? What's the relationship between reason and emotion? How should religion relate to politics? These aren't historical curiosities. They're active problems. Each generation reads Spinoza differently, finding new relevance in old arguments. The 17th century saw him as dangerous atheist. The 18th century ignored him. The 19th century made him romantic hero. The 20th century turned him into academic subject. The 21st century might do something else entirely. That's the test of great philosophy. Not whether it's right, but whether it remains generative. Does it keep producing new insights? Does it help people think through contemporary problems? Does it offer resources for understanding our moment? By that measure, Spinoza succeeds. But there's danger in this kind of success. When a thinker becomes canonical, the radical edge often gets sanded down. Students read Spinoza in survey courses, memorize his concepts for exams, write papers analyzing his arguments. All useful, but it can make philosophy feel like intellectual history rather than lived inquiry. Spinoza didn't write the Ethics to give future professors something to lecture about. He wrote it to offer a way of life, a path to freedom through understanding. The geometric method wasn't decoration, it was discipline. The dense technical terminology wasn't showing off, it was precision. He was trying to help people see reality clearly and live accordingly. That existential dimension gets lost when philosophy becomes purely academic. The propositions get studied, the arguments get reconstructed, the influences get traced. But the fundamental question, how then should I live, recedes into background. We analyze Spinoza's theory of emotions instead of using it to understand our own. We debate his metaphysics instead of asking whether his vision of reality helps us navigate ours. Maybe that's inevitable. Maybe you can't teach philosophy without domesticating it. Maybe the price of preservation is neutering. Better to have Spinoza safely ensconced in university curricula than banned and burned. But something is sacrificed in the transaction. The people who find Spinoza most transformative today often encounter him outside academic contexts. They stumble across the Ethics in a bookstore, read it alone, without expert guidance, and find it speaking directly to their situation. No professor mediating, no scholarly apparatus, just a 17th century lens grinder addressing them across the centuries about freedom, joy, and understanding. That immediate encounter, unmediated by institutions, might capture something essential that academic study misses. Philosophy at its best is personal, before it's professional. It's about your life before it's about intellectual history. Spinoza would have understood this. He didn't work in a university. He didn't have students or disciples in any formal sense. He ground lenses for money and wrote philosophy in his spare time. The people who read his work during his lifetime found it through personal networks, passed hand to hand, discussed in private. It was underground literature, dangerous to own, thrilling to read. We can't recreate that original danger. The shock is gone. You can read Spinoza openly now without risking anything, but maybe we can recover the personal dimension, the sense that philosophy is about how to live rather than what to think. That means taking his ideas seriously enough to test them, not just analysing whether his arguments are valid, but trying his practices. Can you reduce negative emotions through understanding their causes? Can you increase your power to act by following reason? Can you find freedom within determinism? The only way to know is to try. It means engaging with his questions even if you reject his answers. Maybe you think free will exists. Fine, but have you thought through what that means? Have you articulated a coherent account of how free will works? Have you considered the problems it creates? Spinoza forces you to think clearly about these issues, whether you agree with him or not. And it means recognizing that philosophy isn't settled. Spinoza's system isn't the last word on anything. It's one powerful attempt to make sense of existence, valuable precisely because it's different from our default assumptions. We learn by encountering genuine alternatives to our own thinking. The lens grinder from Rheinsberg gave us that. An alternative, a different way of seeing the world. Whether it's the right way is less important than the fact that it exists, that we can try it on, that we can use it to question our own assumptions. And maybe that's the deepest lesson of Spinoza's life. Not the specific doctrines he defended, but the example he set. How to think for yourself in a world that punishes independence. How to maintain intellectual integrity when it costs you everything. How to pursue truth without institutional support or public approval. He did this by making himself economically independent. The lens grinding wasn't a side hobby. It was deliberate strategy. He needed income that didn't depend on saying the right things or pleasing the right people. Manual work gave him freedom that academic positions would have destroyed. Every lens he polished bought him time to think without constraint. He did it by building a network of genuine friends rather than seeking patrons. The people who supported Spinoza weren't doing him favors. They were equals engaged in shared inquiry. When they disagreed with him, they argued. When they thought he was wrong, they told him. This network sustained him through exile and poverty, but it never controlled him. He did it by writing for understanding rather than approval. The ethics wasn't designed to win arguments or impress readers. It was designed to be true. If that made it difficult, so be it. If that made it unpopular, fine. The point wasn't to be read widely. The point was to think clearly. We can't replicate his circumstances. Most of us can't support ourselves through manual labour while pursuing philosophy. The economic structures have changed, but the underlying principle remains available. Create space for independent thought. Don't let your livelihood depend entirely on saying acceptable things. Find communities that value truth over consensus. Write or think or create for understanding first, audience second. This is harder than it sounds. We're all embedded in systems that reward conformity. Academic institutions, corporate structures, social media platforms, all of them punish genuine independence while claiming to celebrate it. They want the appearance of free thinking without the disruption it causes. Spinoza shows us what real independence looks like. It's not dramatic rebellion or performative dissent. It's quiet persistence in pursuing truth regardless of consequences. It's being willing to lose everything rather than think what you're told to think. Most of us will never face excommunication or permanent exile. Our punishments are subtler: social awkwardness, career stagnation, quiet exclusion from opportunities. Not dramatic enough to make us martyrs, just uncomfortable enough to encourage conformity. The question is whether we can maintain independence in the face of these lesser pressures. Spinoza faced the ultimate test and passed. We face smaller tests constantly. Do we pass? His life also reveals something about the relationship between philosophy and biography. We want thinkers whose lives match their ideas. We're disappointed when they don't. The hypocrisy bothers us more than the philosophical errors. Spinoza delivers on this front. He lived what he taught. The ethics argues that human freedom consists in living according to reason, that true power comes from understanding rather than control, that joy emerges from knowledge rather than possession. And Spinoza's life embodied these claims. He had almost no possessions. He exercised no control over others. He pursued understanding relentlessly, and by all accounts, he was remarkably content. This congruence between life and philosophy gives his ideas extra weight. He's not theorizing about freedom from a position of privilege. He's describing what he learned through practice. The ethics reads differently when you know it was written by someone who actually lived according to its principles. But we should be careful here. The biographical fallacy cuts both ways. A philosopher's personal failures don't automatically invalidate their arguments, and a philosopher's personal virtues don't automatically validate their claims. Ideas stand or fall on their own merits. Still, there's something compelling about a thinker who practices what they preach. It suggests they've tested their ideas against reality. It shows they're willing to stake their life on their conclusions. That's not proof of correctness, but it's evidence of seriousness. What would it mean to take Spinoza seriously today? Not as historical curiosity or academic specialty, but as living option. It would mean accepting that freedom and determinism aren't opposites, that you can be free precisely by understanding the causes that determine you, that liberation comes through knowledge rather than ignorance. It would mean recognizing that emotions aren't mysterious forces that happen to you. They're comprehensible responses to how you interpret events. Change the interpretation, change the emotion. Not easily, not instantly, but genuinely. It would mean pursuing understanding as a practical goal, not just intellectual exercise. Understanding why things happen, why people act as they do, why you react as you react. Not to excuse anything, but to gain power over your own responses. It would mean accepting that you're part of nature, not separate from it. That the same laws that govern stars and atoms govern your thoughts and actions. That this isn't degrading, it's liberating. You're not an exception to nature. You're an expression of it. It would mean finding joy in understanding rather than control. You can't control the world. You can't even fully control yourself. But you can understand. And understanding is its own reward, its own form of power. These aren't easy ideas to live by. The entire structure of modern life pushes against them. We're taught that we're free agents, making uncaused choices. We're told that emotions are authentic and should be trusted. We're encouraged to see ourselves as separate from and superior to nature. We're promised that control and possession will bring happiness. Spinoza offers a completely different framework, and the question is whether it works better. Not whether it's more comfortable or more popular, but whether it actually helps you live well. The test is personal. You can read all the scholarship on Spinoza, understand every argument in the ethics, trace his influence through philosophical history, and still miss the point if you don't ask whether his vision helps you navigate your life. Does understanding the causes of your emotions reduce their power over you? Does accepting determinism make you more or less free? Does seeing yourself as part of nature rather than separate from it change how you relate to the world? Does pursuing understanding bring more satisfaction than pursuing control? Try it and see, not as academic exercise, but as experiment in living. Take one of Spinoza's claims and test it against your experience. See if it clarifies anything. See if it helps. Maybe you'll conclude it doesn't work. Maybe you'll find his framework too abstract or too deterministic or too demanding. That's fine. The point isn't to convert you to Spinozism. The point is to engage seriously with an alternative way of understanding human existence. Because the real danger isn't rejecting Spinoza. The real danger is never encountering him at all. Never considering that there might be radically different ways of making sense of freedom, emotion, knowledge, and joy. Never questioning the assumptions embedded in how we normally think about these things. The lens grinder from Rheinsberg spent his life developing an alternative. He gave us a complete system, worked out in meticulous detail, for understanding ourselves and the world. It's strange and difficult and frequently counterintuitive, but it's coherent, it's comprehensive, and it's been tested by 3.5 centuries of readers who found something valuable in it. That's the inheritance, not a set of doctrines to accept or reject, but a way of thinking to engage with, a framework to try on, to see how it fits, to use as a tool for examining your own assumptions. Spinoza died in 1677, probably from lung disease, exacerbated by years of inhaling glass dust. He was 44 years old. He died in the small rented room where he'd lived and worked for the last years of his life. His landlord and a few friends were present. He left behind almost no possessions. His manuscripts, his lens grinding equipment, a few books, some clothes. That was it. The Ethics was published later that year by his friends, anonymously, with a false imprint. Even in death, even after his death, his ideas were dangerous enough to require concealment. But they survived. They circulated underground, gained readers, sparked controversies, influenced thinkers. Slowly, gradually, Spinoza's vision became part of Western intellectual tradition. Not mainstream, never mainstream, but present, available, a permanent alternative to conventional ways of thinking. And now, 3.5 centuries later, you've spent time with his ideas. You've followed his life from Amsterdam to Rheinsberg to The Hague. You've seen what he sacrificed and what he achieved. You've encountered his vision of freedom, emotion, knowledge, and joy. The question is what you do with this encounter. Do you file it away as interesting historical information? Do you engage with it seriously as a potential framework for understanding your own life? Do you use it to question assumptions you didn't know you had? There's no right answer. Spinoza would probably say that your response is determined by your nature, your circumstances, your level of understanding. You'll do what you'll do, but his life and work offer you something rare, a genuinely different way of seeing. Not a minor variation on familiar themes, but a fundamental reorientation of how we think about ourselves and the world. Most philosophy adjusts the picture. Spinoza replaces the frame. Whether you use that new frame is up to you, but now you know it exists. The lens grinder's alternative is available whenever you want to try it. That's his legacy, not monuments or institutions or schools of disciples. Just an alternative, a different way, a lens for seeing clearly. The Ethics ends with a warning and a promise. The path Spinoza describes is difficult. Few will follow it. Those who do will face resistance from others and from their own habits. It requires sustained effort and clear thinking and willingness to abandon comforting illusions. But for those who persist, he promises something extraordinary. Not happiness in the conventional sense, not pleasure or success or admiration, something harder to name. Blessedness, he calls it, the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding, from living according to reason, from seeing yourself and the world clearly. He claims to have found this himself, and the evidence suggests he did. The excommunicated lens grinder living in rented rooms, poor and isolated and working himself to death, was, by all accounts, remarkably content. He'd achieved what he'd set out to achieve. He'd understood. Whether his promise holds for others, whether understanding really does bring blessedness, you can only discover through your own experience. The arguments are there in the Ethics, worked out with geometric precision. But arguments don't make you free. Understanding does. So the invitation stands, 3.5 centuries after it was first extended. See the world as Spinoza saw it. Not through his eyes exactly, you can't do that, but through the lens he ground. Try his framework, test his claims, see if understanding the causes of things gives you power over them. See if freedom lives within necessity rather than opposed to it. See if joy comes from knowledge rather than possession. See if the examined life is worth living after all. The lens is available. Whether you use it is entirely up to you. We started with a question about how a banned heretic became one of philosophy's most influential figures. The answer isn't what you'd expect. Spinoza didn't win through persuasion or compromise. He didn't moderate his views or seek acceptance. He simply thought what he thought, wrote what he believed, and let the consequences come. The excommunication stood. The bans remained. He died poor and unknown, and yet his ideas outlived everyone who condemned them. That's the first lesson. Truth doesn't need institutional approval to spread. It needs clarity. It needs someone willing to think it through completely, regardless of where the logic leads. Spinoza gave us that. A system worked out with such rigor that you couldn't dismiss it without engaging seriously with the arguments. The second lesson is about intellectual courage. Not the dramatic kind, not martyrdom or rebellion for its own sake. The quiet kind. Thinking what you actually think, rather than what's safe to think. Spinoza lost everything by refusing to pretend. His community, his family connections, his economic security, his reputation. Most people would have broken. He ground lenses and kept thinking. The third lesson is about freedom. We think freedom means having choices, being able to do otherwise, escaping causation. Spinoza flips this completely. Freedom is understanding causation. The more you grasp why things must be as they are, why you react as you react, why events unfold as they unfold, the more power you have. Not power to change what's determined, power to align yourself with it instead of fighting pointlessly against necessity. This sounds passive. It's not. Understanding the causes of your anger gives you leverage over it that simply feeling angry never could. Understanding why you want destructive things lets you redirect the desire rather than just suppressing it. Understanding the causal chains that produce this moment frees you from wishing things were different and lets you work with what actually is. The fourth lesson is about ethics without gods. Spinoza proved you could build a complete moral framework without divine commands, without afterlife rewards, without supernatural enforcement. Morality becomes about understanding what promotes human flourishing and acting accordingly. Not because you'll be punished if you don't, but because understanding what you are tells you how to live well. This project continues. Every secular ethical system since Spinoza inherits his basic move. You don't need mythology to explain why cruelty is wrong or kindness is good. You need clear thinking about human nature and what allows it to thrive. The fifth lesson is about integration. Mind and body aren't separate substances mysteriously interacting. They're two ways of describing one thing. Your thoughts are your neural activity viewed from inside. Your brain states are your thoughts viewed from outside. This dissolves a problem that had plagued philosophy for millennia, and it anticipated what neuroscience would confirm centuries later. But here's what matters more than any specific claim. Spinoza demonstrated that you could question everything and build something coherent from the ground up. You didn't have to accept tradition or authority or revelation. You could start with what you can know for certain and reason your way forward carefully, checking each step. The geometric method seems antiquated now. Nobody writes philosophy as axioms and theorems anymore. But the underlying commitment to rigor, to saying exactly what you mean, to making your reasoning explicit so others can check it, that's still the standard. Spinoza set that standard. His influence is everywhere, but often invisible. When scientists assume nature operates by knowable laws without exception, that's Spinoza. When people argue for free speech and separation of church and state, that's Spinoza. When someone says they're spiritual but not religious, finding meaning in nature rather than supernatural claims, that's Spinoza. When therapists help clients understand the causes of their emotional patterns, that's applied Spinozism. The ideas spread so thoroughly, they became background assumptions. We're all Spinozists now, in some basic ways, whether we realize it or not. The lens grinder's vision of a rational, unified, law-governed universe became the default educated position. Yet something gets lost when ideas become mainstream. The shock disappears. The challenge fades. Spinoza becomes another historical figure, studied in courses rather than a living alternative to conventional thinking. The radical edge gets sanded down. Maybe that's unavoidable. Maybe ideas have to be domesticated before they can spread. But it means something essential about Spinoza's project gets missed. He wasn't just making metaphysical claims or building abstract systems. He was offering a way of life. The ethics is instruction manual, as much as philosophical treatise. Here's how to understand your emotions. Here's how to gain power over them. Here's how to find freedom within necessity. Here's how to achieve lasting satisfaction, rather than temporary pleasure. These are practical claims that you can only evaluate by trying them. And that's the real test. Not whether Spinoza's arguments are logically valid, though they mostly are. Not whether his metaphysics matches current physics, though sometimes it does. But whether his approach actually helps you live better. Does understanding the causes of your reactions reduce their power over you? Does accepting that your choices are determined make you more or less free? Does seeing yourself as part of nature, rather than separate from it, change how you relate to the world? The only way to know is to try. The lens grinder's legacy isn't a set of doctrines to memorize. It's a lens to look through, a different way of seeing the same reality. You can pick it up, use it, see what it reveals. You can put it down if it doesn't help. But now you know it exists. 3.5 centuries after his death, Spinoza still offers what he offered his first readers. An alternative, a complete, coherent, carefully worked out alternative to conventional ways of understanding freedom, emotion, knowledge, morality, and meaning. Not the only alternative, not necessarily the right alternative, but a genuine alternative. And in a world that pressures everyone toward the same assumptions, toward the same ways of thinking, toward the same conclusions, having alternatives matters. They let you step outside your own framework long enough to see it clearly. They give you distance from beliefs you didn't know you held. That's what makes Spinoza dangerous even now. Not his specific claims about substance or attributes or geometric necessity, but his demonstration that you can think completely differently and have it all hold together. That you can question everything and build something comprehensive from the ground up. That you can live according to principles that contradict everything your society assumes. The excommunication, the bans, the centuries of condemnation, they all try to suppress this basic fact. That alternatives exist, that you can think for yourself, that intellectual independence is possible if you're willing to pay the price. Spinoza paid it, lost his community, his security, his chance at conventional success, died young, poor, alone, and still managed to plant ideas that grew into trees that reshaped the intellectual landscape. That's not consolation exactly, but it's something. The question that haunted him from his excommunication until his death was how to live well without the structures everyone else relied on, without divine commands to follow, without community to belong to, without hope of immortality, just yourself, nature, and the drive to understand. His answer was that understanding itself is enough. Not understanding everything, that's impossible, but understanding what you can, grasping the causes of things, seeing how it all fits together, finding joy in comprehension rather than control. Whether that answer satisfies you depends on what you need from life. If you need certainty, Spinoza won't help. If you need comfort, look elsewhere. If you need community, you'll have to build it yourself. But if you need clarity, if you need intellectual honesty, if you need a framework that doesn't flinch from difficult conclusions, the lens grinder's work remains available. The starry heavens above and the moral law within, Kant would write a century later, echoing without knowing it the vision Spinoza had articulated. Two sources of wonder: the infinite universe operating by necessary laws, the capacity for reason and ethical action that makes humans part of that universe rather than separate from it. Spinoza saw both clearly, understood both completely, and spent his life grinding lenses so he could help others see what he saw. Some of those lenses are literal, the telescopes and microscopes that extended human vision into new realms. Some are metaphorical, the conceptual frameworks that let us see ourselves and the world differently. All of them are tools. And tools don't care who uses them or why. They just work if you use them properly. The ethics is a tool. The theory of emotions is a tool. The political treatise is a tool. Pick them up, try them, see if they're useful for your purposes. But remember that tools require practice. You can't read the ethics once and expect immediate transformation. You can't grasp Spinoza's vision of freedom without working through why determinism doesn't mean fatalism. You can't achieve what he called blessedness without sustained effort to understand, rather than simply react. The path he describes is difficult. He says so himself in the final lines of the Ethics. All excellent things are as difficult as they are rare. But for those who persist, who genuinely commit to understanding over opinion, to reason over passion, to clarity over comfort, he promises something extraordinary. Not happiness in the conventional sense, something harder to name, blessedness. The deep satisfaction that comes from seeing clearly, from acting according to your nature, from achieving the only kind of freedom that's actually possible. He claimed to have found it himself. The evidence suggests he did. The excommunicated lens grinder, poor and isolated and working himself to death, was by all accounts remarkably content. He'd achieved what he set out to achieve. He'd understood. Whether his promise holds for you, whether understanding really does bring blessedness, whether the examined life is worth the effort, you can only discover through your own experience. The arguments are there in the ethics. The framework is available. The alternative exists. What you do with it is entirely up to you.